Hello everyone, thanks for coming outside with me today. Today we're opening up a can of worms. Oh, that tastes terrible. It's like the gall and bitterness of an angry archer mixed with the sweat of a keyboard warrior. It's delicious. Yeah, so we're gonna ruffle some feathers, we're gonna upset a few people, but I kind of like doing this in a tongue-in-cheek sort of way, although this topic today I'm incredibly serious about, and that is stop tuning your arrows. And there's a lot of intricacies when I say that, but I genuinely mean it. Stop, please, tuning your arrows, because I get emails daily, weekly. I mean, I'm gonna start forwarding them to you. If you really want it home, I'll forward them to you. There are so many emails I get from folks that are saying, I'm trying to tune my arrow to my bow to find the correct arrow that shoots out of my bow. And it's really frustrating to me as someone who's been around archery, works in a shop, and been around the industry for so long, that bows of today are specifically engineered and designed to be worked on. People are not designing bows now to have to go back to the olden days of the 80s and 90s and tune their arrows to their bow. So let's go back and do a little bit of history here. I know it's going to sound a little bit boring, but if you're unfamiliar with where archery has started, it will really shed some light on why we're here today in terms of compound bows and our arrows, and why we have the certain products that we have before this kind of arrow tuning to the bow kind of craze started again. So let's start this off by talking about the arrows first, because once we understand the arrows back in the 80s and 90s, we can kind of understand why we're going back to this older style of tuning the arrow to match the bow. Back in the 80s and 90s, all we had was aluminum arrows, right? Now, I didn't shoot back then, but I shot at the tail end of the aluminum arrow when carbon was really starting to get a stranglehold on the market. Aluminum arrows between 400 spine and 250 spine, there were 16 different spines of aluminum arrows back in the 80s and 90s, and everybody shot a different one. And the reason why there were so many different spines is because you didn't have the ability to tune the bow as well. We'll get to the bow here more in a minute. So you had to have a spine, so a 2312, 2216, 2016, 2315, whatever. You had to match the arrow to meet the bow, because the arrow was so much more consistent than the bow was. The tolerance on an aluminum arrow at its price point in particular is insane. A standard aluminum arrow was about $65 a dozen in today's money. The Easton Camel Hunter, the XX75, runs about $65 for a dozen shafts of a 1000 straightness and plus or minus 2 grains. If you wanted to get that out of a carbon arrow in today's world, you're spending well over $100 to get a 1000 straightness arrow for a dozen shaft. Well over. So you could get almost 2 dozen out of an aluminum for the same price. Since aluminum is so cheap to manufacture in that way and so easy to get at a very high tolerance, it made more sense, because the bows were not very high tolerance, made more sense to get the arrow, because you can control it a little bit more, cut the right length, mess around with point weight a little bit, 100, 125, 150, whatever. You could match that to the bow more specifically. Today, between 250 and 400, there's about 6 different spines, right? 400, 350, 340, 330, 300, and 250. And you can get down to 200, but no one really shoots that. So 250 to 400, you have about 6 different spines. Now, back in the day, Easton made all of the spines, basically, and every aluminum arrow manufacturer basically had all of the different spines. But in today's carbon world, that's not the case. For example, Victory arrows, you can only get a 350. Easton makes 340 and 330. So which one do you pick? You're now pigeonholed to a particular manufacturer, which greatly makes this a variety in today's world than it was back in the old aluminum days. So in the old aluminum days, you would go into your shop, you would have your bow and say, all right, I have this bow at this draw weight, this poundage, and you'd go over to the wall in the shooting range, and they would have a whole bunch of aluminum arrows in different spines cut to approximately your draw length. You would pick some out of the tubes there along the wall, and you would have a guy stand behind you. I kid you not. You would have a guy stand behind you. You would shoot at the target downrange, and the guy behind you would watch, because the bows were so slow and so inefficient. You would watch these big lobbing arrows with the 4-inch vanes or the 5-inch feathers fly down range, and you hoped the guy had good eyesight because he was watching to see if any corkscrewing or fishtailing. You left the bow alone, and you would try different spines of aluminum arrows. One of those 16's bound to work, right? You would try it at the appropriate length for you, and eventually you would get one to work, and the shop would go, all right, you're going to shoot a 25-12, and you would go, that's great, and then you would slam them into an arrow saw, glue in the inserts, throw in the points, get some broadheads, and you would go hunting, and that was it. There was nothing else to do because your bow was so inefficient and there was not a whole lot of tolerance. The arrow was the only thing that was high tolerance, and you had to tune the arrow to the bow. We did not have a choice. So speaking of not having a choice, this also goes back to now the bows that are on the tree. So we'll start with the recurve here, right? So a recurve bow, we all know with a recurve, stick and string, right? There is nothing to change here except for the brace height. And of course the brace height, whether it's a recurve longbow or a compound, refers to the depth between the deepest part of the throat of the grip to the string. This is the brace height. Now, you can twist up the string and make this brace height bigger. You can let twist out of the string and make it shorter, so you have like an inch to an inch and a half, depending on the make of bow that you have of play. But outside of that, there is nothing else to do here. You're not changing the poundage of the limb. Your draw length is how far you draw to anchor. There is nothing else to change here. The center shot, this is a three-piece takedown bow. The center shot here is cut past center, but on a lot of the older traditional wooden recurves, one piece or longbows, it was actually not even cut to center. You couldn't change this. There is no rest. This one does have a burger buttonhole, so you could bolt in a modern day rest, but there was no rest. There was nothing to change. You had to change the arrow. You had to tune the arrow and tune you as the shooter to your bow, because your bow was not going to change. You could change your draw length, your anchor, how you grip the bow, and you could change the length and the spine of your arrow, but that was it. You could not tune the bow. And so if you're a trout archer, you very well understand this concept of tuning the arrow to your bow, because that's all you can do. Work on your shooting form and tuning the arrow. Then we started getting into compounds, and we tried to eliminate some of the arrow and shooter problems, but with the resources that we had available to us, compound bows just weren't that great. So like I said, I don't know the actual age of this old Martin here. A buddy of mine gave it to me, found it at like a local Goodwill. Anyway, real quick, you Matthews shooters who have that interior yoke system, or you prime shooters that have that interior yoke system, yeah, it's on a Martin from like the 1980s, 1990s. Not much has changed in terms of how we want to tune these. There's actually an old PSE bow that had the dual cam, just like prime bows do nowadays. But back in those days, didn't make any sense because these old, big, heavy cam really slowed down the bow, and you couldn't get the same speed out of it. So here's an older bow. It has a cast riser. The cable guard here is actually bolted onto the riser. It's not actually drilled and tapped like out of a modern bow, because a cast riser would literally explode if you drilled through it. And if you know anybody that used to shoot these old bows, you would know that sometimes they would literally blow up because it's a cast riser. There'd be an air pocket in here somewhere, and you'd shoot, 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 and it would just literally crack and explode in your hand. You're shooting 80, 90 pounds to get 240 feet a second. There's no let off. The limbs back in the olden days used to be wood. Now this is a fiberglass type, but it's not a laminated system. It's a one-piece composite limb, prone to splintering and cracks. That's why they have this disc in here to add compression so it wouldn't split right down the center of the limb where they cut it. Lots of inconsistencies in this bow. Like I said earlier, I can literally move these limbs within this limb pocket in terms of its tolerance. There's a huge gap here. The limb pocket does not float like on a modern day compound bow. The limbs, and this is where the bow is more efficient when it's all the way cranked down. That's true of olden style bows, not with bows with floating limb pockets, which is basically anything from 2009 and onward. But back in the 80s and 90s, the limb would move out of the limb pocket, and there were some bows where it was so bad that when the limbs came back forward, now granted these would be less D-shaped under real compression, but they are still very D-shaped under compression. The limbs would come so far forward if you had this backed out far enough that it would actually slap in there, and it would literally sound like a .22 rifle going off in your hand because the limbs would flex and snap in on themselves. You're talking some pretty loose tolerances here. And so when it came to setting up your bow and setting up your old blade style rest, this has an old spring prong rest here. You weren't screwing around with center shot and yoke tuning. This has steel cables, for Pete's sake, okay? There's no adding twist to one side or the other. So you still had to tune the arrow and tune the shooter to the bow. And also this bow here was set up to be shot with fingers, which was a common thing back in the early days of compound. So when people were going from trad to compound, they're still shooting fingers. You really haven't changed much. Now, you do have more efficiency, you get more power out of the bow, so on and so forth. But in terms of the tuning, everything's basically exactly the same. You're tuning the arrow and the shooter to the bow because you had to, because this was way more inconsistent than that nice straight aluminum tube. So as we've evolved and gotten further and further down into the manufacturing and engineering of modern day compound bows, manufacturers are getting better and better at trying to eliminate things outside of the shooter, right? So the shooter variable is by far the biggest part of the tuning. And this is where I'd argue that actually forget the arrow and forget the bow. Tuning the shooter is the most important thing. How you grip, your face pressure, how you're pulling into the back wall, do you shoot cable stops or limb stops? All of those things I think are eons more important than how you tune the bow, and in particular how you tune the arrow. The shooter really does impact, and I'll throw pictures up on the screen. I'll put stuff down in the description below if you're interested in checking out a lot of the things that I've worked with people in Facebook messages, Instagram, and email, and YouTube comments about grip pressure in particular, because that can really, really ruin your tune or make it work really well. So we've gone from you can't tune this to you can't tune this to every manufacturer now is producing something that you can tune. This here is an Elite Kure, and there is so much tuning that you can do with the bow because the tolerances of this are insane compared to what they used to be in the 80s and 90s. We have limb pockets that are so secure. We have, in this case, a limb pocket that's meant to pivot, to tune the arrow to, or tune the bow rather, to the arrow. We have different cam technologies of so much higher tolerance than they ever used to be. The bows are so much faster. We have tuning in our roller guards. We have tuning with the top hat system with Matthews. We have tuning of the shimming of the cam with like the Bowtech Reckoning. It literally shims the cam right on the axle. All of these are things that were deliberate in order to tune the bow so you can shoot many different arrow types out of one bow. And I can go and take this Elite Kure or my Elite Rezult, or if you own a bow that also can be easily tuned with limb pockets or roller guards or shimming the axle in such a way like with Bowtech, it makes life a lot easier when you want to shoot a fat indoor arrow or 3D arrow, a skinny field arrow, a regular diameter, a micro diameter hunting arrow. It makes it so much nicer, so I don't have to constantly try to play around with different spines and different lengths and different point weights. I can literally just make the bow work to the arrow that I want to shoot. Manufacturers have been trying to do this for decades. Why would we want to go back to the old style of trying to tune an arrow specifically to our bow from the 80s and 90s? We've spent decades trying to get to this point. Don't go back. Trust me, it was absolutely awful. It was absolutely miserable. We're now at a point where we can try different fletchings and different point weights and different diameters of arrows. That's all well and good, and it's fine to have a heavy arrow or a high FOC or try something new with an arrow system, but build the arrow first and then tune the bow to the arrow. Don't try to find the arrow that fits the bow, because the bows of today are meant to suit multiple different arrows of weight, spines, lengths, the whole thing. Don't just try to make one arrow work for the bow. Make the bow work for the arrow. That's what they're designed to do. And going back to the arrows really quickly, this is why manufacturers have limited the number of spines now. Now you're down to like 300, 330, 340, 350, and 400. And if you have to shoot like a 450, 500 spine, if you're a short draw light poundage archer. But they know that is so much easier to play with because of today's technology than it was when we had to have 16 different spines of aluminum arrows. The carbon arrow market is deliberately small, so we don't have to mess around with trying to find the right arrow to fit our bow. Our bows are now designed to match the arrows instead of the other way around, like what we used to have to do 20, 30 years ago. So I can already hear you right now, but wait, what about bare shaft tune? And what about paper tuning? And what about knock tuning? Yeah, those are still very legitimate, okay? Those things don't go away, all right? But what those are designed to do, and particularly with the knock tune, is to get all the arrows to react the same. We're going back to the aluminum, right? Okay? Aluminum arrows do not have a seam. Carbon arrows do have a seam, which gives them a weak and a stiff side somewhere. I want all of my arrows to be reacting the same. Oh, but you're saying you're tuning the arrow to the bow. No, I'm tuning the arrow to the other arrow. I want all of the arrows to be exactly the same. I want them to be as high of tolerance as possible. This now is way higher tolerance than the carbon arrows of today. Your modern day compound, doesn't matter what brand you shoot, your modern day compound bow is a way higher tolerance than any single carbon arrow on this market. I don't care if you shoot a 1000 straightness. The spine tolerance, there's always going to be a give. There's always going to be some difference in flex. There's difference in weight that we didn't have to deal with when it came to aluminum arrows. So back in the olden days, we didn't have to noctune aluminum arrows because they were so consistent to each other. There was nothing really to change there. We had to work on our form and work on how we shot the bow because the arrows were so consistent compared to each other. Carbon arrows, no matter the straightness, there's going to be a seam somewhere in that arrow, and if you just plug a nock in differently, you might have a different flex and a different spine deviation based on how that arrow shot out of the bow. So I do noctune and bear shaft tune so they all fly the seam in relation to each other. Then when I figure out where they're all tearing exactly the same, then I move my rest. Then if I need to play with the set technology of my Elite Kure, I can do that and get perfect bullet holes. If you're interested in how I do that, by the way, I'll put a link in the description to me setting up this Elite Kure and how I played with the rest and how I played with the set technology to tune the bow to the arrow that I specifically built for my hunting rig this fall. So I know I rambled on and might have gone off the rails a little bit, but I hope you understand what I'm trying to say here. Tune your very high tolerance bow to your lesser tolerance arrow now. Back in the day, the arrows were higher tolerance than the bows we had available to us. Now we can tune our high tolerance bow and tune the shooter. Again, it is so important that you focus on your grip tuning, your torque tuning, and your face pressure. Don't just think, oh, I can tune the bow and make the arrows all shoot the same and you're gonna be fine. You have to focus on your shooter form. Try it at home. Message me, send me an email, Facebook, Instagram message, whatever, and I will help you through the process of getting your torque tuning and getting your grip and your face pressure and figuring out you first, then figuring out your bow, and then figuring out all your arrows so they react exactly the same to each other. So if your feelings are hurt or if you agree with me and you want to tell me either way, send me an email down in the description, follow the Instagram or Facebook links, and of course you can always leave a comment here on YouTube. Hope you're able to get outside, enjoy the sport of archery hunting if you so choose. Definitely enjoy God's beautiful creation, and we'll get to see you next time.